Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our session on the future of conservation. I'm Harold Varmus, very happy to be here moderating with my new friend Joe Walston from the Wildlife Conservation Society. Dystopia has been a dramatically prominent theme of yesterday's discussion, and the sense I got after several hours of listening is that we're living in a dystopic world created by one person. But dystopia in general is something we apply to the future, and in the discourse that I have heard over the years from fellow scientists and pundits, is that we're either the planet itself is going to be destroyed, we're going to lose all of our species, or human beings will be unable to survive in a world created by the adverse effects of the Anthropocene in which we're living. A few months ago, I was traveling in West Africa and met someone who is a colleague of Joe's, who told me about an article recently published in Bioscience magazine that presents a somewhat different view about the future of humanity and the future of our ability to sustain living species. And I read this with a combination of optimism and skepticism, and suggested to Ben that we might have one of the authors, and in particular Joe Walston, come to Kent Presents and say something about this new view of how we might improve at least the speciation of the planet and our ability to conserve species. And Joe has kindly agreed to come. The manner in which we're going to proceed here is Joe's going to talk for about 10 minutes or so about the thesis that is spelled out in his article in Bioscience, and perhaps ornament that with a few other things. He and I will follow up his presentation with a couple of exchanges, and then we hope to have at least 10, maybe even 15 minutes in which to entertain questions, comments, expressions of enthusiasm, skepticism, or determination to do something along the lines that he might recommend. We will look forward to a lively exchange with the audience before concluding at 12:05. You all recognize the schedule has been pushed back because of some very talkative people in earlier sessions. We will have our full 35 minutes, and we'll be done no later than 12:05. Joe.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the Rosens especially for this. This has been my first and fantastic experience. Like you, I was not surprised, but a little worn down by the overriding air of gloom and despair around us at the moment. And the only surprise for me is I come from the most despairing of all of the disciplines, which is the environment. Throughout all of your lifetimes, there has been little islands of joy in what has been, on the whole, a consistent set of declines on anything that we have valued. Myself, I started working on Asian elephants in Vietnam. At the moment, they started opening up their economy. I worked in Laos and Indochina for 12 years, moved to the Congo Basin for a number of years in Southern Africa, and only recently have moved my family to now live in New York. And so I didn't say anything. And so it is, my career has been one of, the joys has been when we have managed to slow decline. And that's been really our greatest victory. But one of the other things I've been concerned about for a number of years is observing what is going to be happening in these countries which are changing so rapidly. What are the influences and how does that affect us? And in every country I lived in, I was always told, our country is different, our culture is different, our society is different. We're going to follow a different trajectory than those that your country followed or the US went through. And what's happened over the last few decades has been demonstrating the fact that it's not different. That actually humans all around the world have the same desires, the same needs, the same inclinations, and follow the same trajectories. And so what we're seeing now in the world is continued decline. I don't want to make any bones about it. We're going to see further declines now of the things that we love in nature over the next few years. But if I was to ask you, what are the conditions by which you want to see in the world, which would then allow for a real recovery of nature, what would they be? I'm going to suggest that the first one is a stabilization of the human population. It doesn't really matter if it's 8 billion, 9 billion, 11 billion, but if it continues to change and continues to go up, that really poses the greatest challenge to us ever doing anything about the environment. So the stable human population. Secondly, that population is out of extreme poverty. There's no hope, really, when we are still grappling with both an actual a moral problem and an actual problem of moving people out of extreme poverty, which has blighted the planet for such a long period of time, and continues also to be an environmental challenge, not just a moral and ethical one. And then the third one is that we, wherever we are, we have greater appreciation, understanding, and lessening impact on environment as individuals. So if those three things actually happen, imagine what we could actually do. And for the last 3 years, a few of us, Eric Sanderson, John Robinson, and myself, have worked borrowing huge amounts of effort from demographers, economists, and people outside our own world, to be able to understand more about what is happening. And what is happening, I think, is incredibly exciting. It is providing the basis for exactly what I described. The world's human population has been going up, is still going up, but the rate of increase was at its maximum when? When was the rate of increase of the human population at its highest? No, the 1960s, mid-1960s.
Our lifetimes, boys and girls.
And imagine what you were doing then. That was at the peak. Ever since then, that rate has been going down. And the world population, on the whole, is now reaching stabilization to such a point that within the next 100 years, and within the lifetime of probably your children or grandchildren, the world's population will actually, for the first time, stabilize. Now that is such an important fact, but it's so little known. Many areas of the world actually now have stable populations or are decreasing already. Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East are the only two places in the world left now where the rate of increase is still going up. And we're going to talk about this a bit more. The second one is urbanization. Urbanization, we've heard a bit about already. I'm very interested also in the cities talk coming up later, is the one commonality across the world when people are allowed to choose. How is it that China went through such a great transformation of removing people out of poverty? The greatest leap of out of poverty in the history of humankind has happened in China in the last few decades. Why? Because they were allowed to choose more. They were allowed to move, the freedom of movement, the freedom of commerce. And what did they do? They moved to the coast and they moved to the cities. And this urbanization happened in Industrial Revolution Britain over 200 years ago, happened in the US, it's now happening everywhere around the world. Latin America, 85% urbanized already and going up. So the world is urbanizing. Often we think of urbanizing as an effect of economic growth. But actually what happens in urban areas is remarkable. And this is one of the big, great drivers. And for someone who's lived in the wilds of the Congo Basin and Indochina for many years, I deeply underappreciated what urbanization and what happens in these urban areas. Urban areas for the environment are great. They're fantastic. They're on two formats, not just because they pull people off land. The traditional idea of environmentalists, oh, they pull people off land, allowing people space, nature space. Maybe, maybe not. We also consume, and that puts demands back on the rural areas. The reason it does is because when people move to urban areas, especially in poor countries, they have greater access to basic healthcare, basic education. The levels of abuse, especially to women, go down. Female empowerment goes up considerably in those areas. And they end up, after reform, having a greater investment, choosing to have a greater investment in fewer children. And that transition, both there's an ability of women to be able to do that and the ability to access the resources, is a key defining feature of urbanization across the world. We love the bucolic scenes of rural life, and we look at slums and think how awful and dreadful they are. Well, the statistics tell you otherwise. The ability, you do not want to be poor in the countryside. You do not want to be a woman and poor in the countryside. Cities offer a remarkable array of goods. Now, of course, cities can work well, they can work badly. But on the whole, urbanization is this driving force behind population stabilization, ideation, the ability to movements, all environmental movements, by the way. Where do they come from? Cities. They came from cities in this country, they came from cities in Europe, they're coming from cities in China and those other areas. And so what we're now seeing are all the effects. And by the way, those of you who live in cities, thank you. Because honestly, there's a wonderful study that came out in comparing New Yorkers. I don't often talk up New Yorkers, but just for a moment.
You are one now. You better talk them up.
As you can tell, I am now a fully integrated New Yorker. They use 74% less water than the average American. They use 35% less electricity. And they use 45% less garbage. The ideas of cities are remarkable in terms of their efficiency. And you just imagine being able to get electricity or goods to people in the rural areas and how much environmental cost there is in that, to be able to do that. So cities on the whole are better functioning. We often talk down cities because they look dirty and they look crowded and but they have a remarkable set of functions. So what we are calling the bottleneck is where countries are moving out of extreme poverty. They are requiring a huge amount of the environment. There is no country in the world, or very few anyway, that have been able to avoid coming out of poverty and developing, which has not converted their natural capital to their economic capital. Whether it's our own countries that are going through that, or in some cases we have taken from other countries to be able to feed that and drive that. That has to happen. But what is happening now is that the last few countries and regions of the world are now doing that to such a point whereby very soon we can start to imagine a world that has a stable human population out of extreme poverty, predominantly urbanized, with a shared sense of values in a globalized society, in a globalized economy, that have a valuation and a lower impact on nature. And if we have that, whatever at that point, whatever of nature we have got through that bottleneck, will not just be the last remnants, will not just be the last living museums of what the earth once was. Those will be the basis of a renaissance of recovery of nature. In Europe now, we are struggling with the terrors of having wolves back and having bears come across these mountains, and the recovery of many of these iconic species that we thought were completely lost. In my tiny relevant island off the northwest coast, we're now debating about having back wolves and even some of the larger animals that we lost when the Romans arrived. And we're now having that conversation. In India now, when I first went to India, and I'll finish now on this, when I first went to India as a 21-year-old, I was to go and see tigers. I was devastated, and I almost left conservation, because all I saw were millions of people living in extreme poverty around tiny islands of heavily protected areas with a few tigers in that people like me were paying to see. What was the future of that? You may as well go to the Bronx Zoo and see them there. What really was the point? Now I go back to these islands now are not only growing and reconnecting, but who's there? Middle-class Indians with large Nikon lenses, the biggest market for Nikon lenses in the world, Bangalore. Wealthy Indians paying for nature, advocating for nature, voting for nature in those areas, buying up land, forming conservancies in this area. We have had to double the expectation of what those tigers are going to be in the landscape over the next 20 years. Because now, because we held on to those islands through this Karnataka's own bottleneck, that now we are seeing a recovery and a reconnection of nature, a renaissance in nature, all driven by society who are voting for, advocating, and fighting for nature. And so I'm going to finish there, but that is a picture that we used to talk about just in Western Europe and the United States. I'm now seeing in a number of places around the world, and the evidence is that in the next 100 years, this is the 100 years. This actually is possibly even less than 100 years. We're going to define which species are going to form the recovery and renaissance in nature, and which are going to go the passenger pigeon. And will never happen. There's never been a more important time, there's never been more exciting time than now. We can see the end in the tunnel, the light is bright, our job is clear, it's not inevitable, but if we do so, we really are forming now for the future of a possible renaissance in nature.
Thank you, Joe. I'd like to bring up 2 points about what you said and about the essay that you and your colleagues wrote. One is fairly technical and specific about population growth. The other, a more general question about something that wasn't really addressed in your essay. First, the paper goes to some extremes to point out that there's a great likelihood that population will stabilize not at the currently estimated 10 to 11 billion, but closer to roughly 6 billion. And how you seem to be moving off that a little bit today and saying that it's okay if it's actually 10 or 11 billion. How much does that matter? And the other thing that I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about is the relationship of everything you said to climate change. Many people who are dystopic in the current conversation about the next 100 years are heavily focused on the changes in our atmosphere that are resulting in the rise in temperatures, and that obviously has dramatic effects on virtually everything you say, on population and on urbanization and on rewilding.
Yes, on the population one, it's interesting. By the way, I now have a new love for demographers. If you ever, it's a new.
I've loved them for a long time.
Have you? And I'm just discovering that. But
the biggest thing in my own life that I still haven't really absorbed is when I was born, there were less than 2 billion people on Earth, and now there are over 7. And that's an incredible change in the way we think about the future of humanity and the species that try to co-populate the Earth with us. So
absolutely, and we need a bit of humbleness. We have been, all of our lifetimes has been one thing about population increase. So it's very hard for us to imagine anything but that. Doesn't seem right to think about anything about it. But demographers are also very collaborative, more so than in many of our industries, our own industries. And they come around these ideas, they call these 5 shared socioeconomic pathways. The likelihood that the world's population will go from the extremes. One extreme we know is just keeps on going up. And you know what that'll cause that? Is if we become isolationist. It's really fascinating. Demographers are saying that one way to really ensure that we continue to go through the 12 billion barrier is actually from shutting up shop, not trading, actually reducing immigration and preventing such. But the other is actually the 6 billion, as you say. There is, of course, not just that we are stopping where we are, but that it will increase and then decrease and then stabilize. And that's actually, ironically, if we continue to be a globalized, connected world, if we continue to share and allow immigration, both for economic reasons, to be able to, and to help with stabilization and people to be able to find their place, that is going to lead to a point where the world will then reach its maximum and then decrease and then stabilize. Sub-Saharan Africa is the big question mark. That's the big why sometimes I'm very cautious about the 6 or 7 billion and others. And you know what's going to really make a change in Sub-Saharan Africa, which I find utterly remarkable? If African girls are educated in Sub-Saharan Africa over the next few decades, that will lead to 1 billion people less overall in the human population over the next few decades. 1 billion. And that to me is such a remarkable fact. Basically, that sub-Saharan Africa is really a place we have to double down and support. We have to help with female empowerment. We have to help with general forms of governance. We have to make cities work. If we can make Lagos, if we can make these big cities work, then that's going to have the greatest impact. Towards climate change...
But we do have to think one other thing about demography, and that is the age grouping of these people, because the number of people you have in the active labor force, the number of old people you're trying to support, these make big differences in the way in which society operates with different numbers of people.
Absolutely, and I want to be
probably too much to get into here, but let's go on to.
I'm certainly outside of my competence, and I think to recognise that fact, and there are many other aspects that I don't want to dismiss that, but are outside my levels of expertise, and certainly the world's economy and how it demands and relates new and youth injection into that is a big challenge for us.
Well, it does relate to your point in the paper, which we haven't emphasized here, which is the importance of technology in making urban environments healthy and productive and pleasurable.
Absolutely.
And you know, that depends very much on youth and
Yes, and we should also see that people around the world, when they're given a choice, and they're given a choice even between these cities that we vilify so readily, so quickly, they still choose to move to cities. And it's very often that we should, in many societies and areas where we would look at that and go, why wouldn't you want to stay in the countryside? Well, the truth is a lot more subtle and much more profoundly dark about why, and more optimistic about cities. But to climate change, yes, I mean, to include climate change specifically in a lot of the paper was beyond its limits. But the same issues apply. We expect climate change to get worse. We want it to, the world's action to get better. There are going to be unpredictable technologies out there which are going to help us with these issues. But nonetheless, the ability to retain nature at this stage of the next few decades is not only going to be an immediate contribution to climate change at the moment. If we lose our intact forests, the Congo Basin, the Amazon Basin, if we allow that to be cut up and carved up as it is now, not only forget the 2%, the 2-degree limits, we're talking about a whole new conversation. A lot of these expectations are based on us retaining these large forests. So not only do we think that the focus on cities and promotion of cities is an immediate and measurable contribution to immediate climate change mitigation effects, but the world's attention at the same time has to be on these and getting as much of these intact forests through this bottleneck for our immediate livability of the planet, but also the ability to then respond and bring down the temperature, which we will be doing at some stage. The question is, after, how high does it have to go? How hot does it have to become? Until such a time where the world responds accordingly. At that time, I'm confident that we're going to be able to, through technologies, through policies, we're going to be able to bring that down. The question is, what is the impact on the world going to be at that point? What will we have lost during that transition? And so the immediate effects on the environment for us are by adopting this view of what could be in 100 years, or even less than 100 years, by shifting our focus to accordingly. Not only can we be more responsive to the immediate problems, but the long-term impacts, the medium-term impacts will be disproportionately larger than they are through the activities that we're doing today.
I'm going to return to the audience in just 1 second to ask you to challenge Joe on these points and raise some questions. But Joe, maybe you could just very briefly give 3 or 4 things that you think individuals or communities should be doing to try to achieve, because you know, as you made clear, these are possibilities. They have to be achieved by presumably by certain actions that the communities and nations and perhaps the world together take. If you could just address succinctly a few points that you think people should be thinking about as action items and to achieve the more optimistic view of the world that you're espousing.
So at a global level, I think there are 4 things we need to be able to do. I think we need to understand we need to make cities work. I think New York is a fantastic example of a city actually that does function. You all probably know 1,000 problems within New York, but as a foreigner, as a guest in New York, I think it's the most remarkable functioning city, and the number of ideas and thoughts and that come out of it at the moment on all fronts, especially the environment, is just remarkable. So you shouldn't underestimate the value of that.
Here, except the average doesn't take the subway very often. But
and I think also the world looks to New York. I think, forget about countries increasingly, people are looking at cities. Cities are both wonderfully sheltered, often from their federal activities and their greater the parenthood. And the second one would be intact forests. These large chunks of intact forest at the moment, we have to be able to refocus on. People are ignoring them because they're standing. Do you know people would much rather plant a tree than prevent a tree from being cut down? And we've got to get over that. The disproportionate influence of those standing forests are something we've got to do. We have to support sub-Saharan Africa, both in terms of, I think, supporting female empowerment in sub-Saharan Africa is an environmental, apart from its moral imperative, it is an environmental imperative and a global imperative, I believe. That's the third one. And the fourth one is to continue to be open to the world's trade, immigration, and freedom of movement of the peoples of the world. I think that is a fundamentally important aspect of this. I don't mean uncontrolled, I don't mean unfettered, and I don't mean to get political at all in that statement. That statement is purely a recognition that where people have been able to move, it has usually increased prosperity for themselves, moved people out of poverty, and, this is the odd bit, usually ended up helping contribute to global environmental values.
To the audience, questions, hands, microphones right here, yes. Yes.
Thanks for a stimulating talk. I appreciate your optimism. I have 3 points I'm going to push back on. I'm a pessimist professionally. First of all, I think the example of New York City is way off base. I think it's a very American-centric example that you've given. And it's kind of apples and oranges. New York City is more efficient than the suburbs of America, where they consume more, they have 2.5 cars per family. In New York, there's 0.4 cars per family. I get that. That's not the same in China. That's not the same in the Middle East. That's not the same in most countries. People who live in cities consume more energy, they produce more garbage. They can just consume much, much more than rural people, their rural counterparts. So I wanted to push you on that.
Can I answer? Because I'm only concerned, I think it's a valid point. I'm looking at the time down here and that, and I'm worried if I can't respond to that. I think you're absolutely, I take your point. I've lived in many of these countries for the most of my life. The bit that comparison is the comparison of the same wealth. So if one takes anyone from any country at any city in the same wealth bracket, in the countryside and in the cities, they will have almost invariably low environmental impacts across those areas. What you're recognizing, of course, is that when someone in poverty moves to a city and gains wealth, they then consume more, which is absolutely right. So the transition that we really see is that the greatest consumption of nature happens when someone transitions out of poverty into middle classes or non-poverty, whatever one wants to describe about. If you give a poor person $1 tomorrow, that person will spend, understandably, most of that dollar on natural resources, mostly food. If you give me $1, a very small fraction of that dollar will actually go on additional natural resources. I might save it, I might spend it on an app, I might do a variety of different things with it. So that transition of people moving out of poverty usually, almost invariably comes with a large cost of nature, and that's what we're seeing. So when you refer to China or all of those areas, that's exactly right. You're exactly seeing. But that is a necessary transition that comes with a high cost to the environment. But that natural transition is the only way we will lead to a situation where the population stabilizes. Having people continuously in poverty, aside from the moral depravity of us allowing that to be able to happen, is in the long term just a ticking time bomb for the environment.
We have a large population of hands here, and I want to get a couple of other hands. Sarah, thanks very much for the question. But we'll
love to catch
back
up.
to get a few more people in the mix here. Over here, lady in red.
Hi, I just want to ask you a question about extinction. And I've read the book, The Sixth Extinction, where there's a net loss of species. And I wanted to know if you thought we needed to prioritize species conservation to those that are more useful, and I put that in quotes, and who would make those decisions on a global basis or a local basis, and how do we justify our own existence as human beings probably being the least useful species on the planet for the natural world?
You sound like my wife.
Yeah.
No. She,
that is your
the least useful species on the planet. But yeah, really interesting question. I think the point you make is very well done. In the time we have, I can't really answer that in its fullness. And of course, anyone from any sector, whether it be the people who talk about fish or talk about aquatic bacterial life, will be able to tell you, or soil bacteria, tell you that their areas are most important. And if we don't concentrate on that, then we're all doomed. I take the vision that we need societies to adopt nature, and therefore we should be focusing on the iconic species. I think if we lose the elephants, we lose the great whales, we lose the tigers of this world, then we lose any chance of really engaging the society and the next generations, and really why we should be saving the world. We can be informed. If we're inspired by nature, we'll be open to understanding why soil bacteria is important. If we're inspired by nature, we will then respond to the people who want to save the earthworms or the other species. But if we're not inspired by nature, then we'll get closed off. Then we aren't responsive. So I'm a big advocate for saying that we would be a poorer species if we lose the rhinos, if we lose the tigers. They are also iconic in a number of ways. They inspire pride in nations that haven't got a tradition of wildlife conservation in those areas. And if you go and see, India is not going to let the tiger go extinct. And fantastic. China is not going to let the panda go extinct. Now, they've got a long way to go on many other areas, but if we can engender that sort of global pride in these ones, in our countries, then I think is the greatest mechanism for being able to save everything else in those areas. If we lose those, shame on us. And if we can't even keep what these very simple, I think because they are simple, large species like tigers alive, then what hope have we got of anything else?
And you're not so much worried about Anopheles mosquitoes.
Exactly.
Yes, lady right here, in blue. We're doing color coding.
I also appreciate your optimism. Thank you. I note from your bio that you cover the marine realm. And the issue of marine debris in our oceans is of significant note. There are a lot of people talking about and researching how marine debris, 80% of it comes from the land. And so solutions are around waste management and closing the loop. And I'm interested in hearing from you what you think the responsibility is of the brands as well as the government.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an unbelievably large issue. And just one point of recognition. I mean, isn't it wonderful how in a few months the world has changed its attention and turned its attention to recognizing marine waste and plastics as a big issue. And yet, of course, it is a terrible thing. But I am even more encouraged by the fact that the world actually is getting together and doing something about it. I think there is a personal responsibility all the way through. I'm hoping that governments end up legislating for this, even if it's just a simple form of taxation. I think that we all take a personal responsibility, but also governments of the world now, I think, are coming together to look at also global agreements on plastics. I'm encouraged again that cities are taking the lead on this. It's the cities which are responding most rapidly to this. The leaders of these cities and their usually are, and the populace themselves are at the forefront of this. We have many other issues like the plastics in the seas. We have the chemicals in our, we have the nitrogen. I think in Charles's talk was fascinating that these great issues that are coming. Technology technology and innovation will come to be able to help us, but unless we have that global shared belief in the valuation of nature and doing something about it, unless we are voting, shouting, and advocating and paying for nature, then none of these challenges will be solved.
We're going to squeeze in one more. Lady at the back, in black.
Thank you. As an environmental educator, we do draw people in with the charismatic megafauna and getting them out into nature. Is there something else that we should be adding to our what should
educators do?
Inspire people with your local nature. Local nature, no matter how small, your little, the river down there, the pond over there, that's it as early as on.
Ed Wilson would call this BioBlitz, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. But get inspired with something local.
Central
once you're
Park,
local,
100 species a day.
Once you're local, that will be the trigger and the catch for you to end up being a global conservationist.
And with that, we've run over time by 35 seconds. Let's give Joe a hand. Great job.